powerful black woman walks into a Fortune 500 boardroom, only to see a smug man sitting in her seat, pretending to run the show. What happens in the next 7 minutes destroys his career and shakes the entire company to its core. A black SUV glided to a halt in front of the gleaming glass facade of one of the most prestigious corporate towers in the city. The building stood like a monument to wealth and influence, its mirrored surface reflecting the morning sun, and the rush of sharply dressed professionals entering its doors. As the chauffeur stepped out and opened the rear door, a woman emerged, calm, centered, and radiating quiet authority. Her suit was impeccably tailored, her heels precise against the polished concrete, her stride unhurried. A few interns near the entrance froze, their chatter dying mid-sentence.
Ow.
One nudged the other, eyebrows raised, watching her pass with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. Inside, the elevator ride was uncomfortably quiet. A few white-collar employees stepped in beside her, giving the obligatory nod but then eyeing her from the corner of their vision. One whispered to another, barely audible over the soft elevator chime, "Is she in the wrong place?" His companion shrugged, smirking. The woman didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her reflection in the elevator's polished walls was enough, steady, unreadable, completely in control. The doors opened on the top executive floor. Frosted glass panels, minimalist decor, and the faint hum of wealth defined the space. Behind one of the glass conference room walls, the boardroom buzzed with activity. Senior executives and mid-tier managers moved about, pouring coffee, setting up documents, joking casually as they prepared for what they thought would be a routine strategy session. At the head of the long mahogany table, a man in his mid-40s had already taken the prime seat, the seat traditionally reserved for whoever would be leading the meeting. He leaned back, one arm draped across the back of the chair, smirking. His posture screamed entitlement. Dressed in an overpriced suit with a bright pocket square and a polished watch he made sure everyone saw, he grinned broadly as he addressed the room. "Well," he announced, "time to clean up this company. Let's bring some real leadership into this place." A few chuckled. One or two exchanged wary glances but said nothing. The man clearly believed he was about to lead something big, or at least convince others that he was meant to. No one objected. When the woman entered the room, the energy shifted instantly. The chatter died down. Chairs creaked slightly as people adjusted themselves. A few eyes widened. The man at the head of the table looked up, smiled condescendingly, and then with a wave of his hand, gestured toward the far end of the room. "Sorry, this one's board level only," he said casually, then turned back to his notes. "We've got water and coffee outside. You might want to check with front desk if you're waiting on someone." She didn't flinch. She walked to the far side of the table, placed her leather briefcase gently on the polished wood, and took a seat, not at the head, not at the end, but directly across from him. Her expression remained neutral, her gaze steady. "Say a word." An uncomfortable tension settled in the room like fog. A few people avoided eye contact altogether. One junior executive opened his mouth, then thought better of it. Another nervously adjusted his tie, sweat forming on his brow. The HR director looked from the woman to the man and then back again. Uncertain, but still no one said anything. Not yet. The man continued talking, flipping through his presentation materials. Charts, performance metrics, corporate jargon. He was in full swing. "We've got to cut the fat," he declared. "Get rid of dead weight. Too many departments running soft. People need structure, not hugs." A forced laugh from someone near the door. He smirked, believing he was owning the room. He was used to this. He'd done this before. He thought this was his moment. The woman sat perfectly still, fingers lightly, resting on her watch face. She wasn't looking at the presentation. She was watching him, not with contempt, not even with annoyance, just observation. It was as if she were conducting a study. 7 minutes. That's all it would take. Her watch ticked quietly beneath her sleeve, a digital countdown slowly approaching 0. He pointed. To the screen again, smug. "Let's be honest, we need better public image. We need someone who looks the part, someone people take seriously." Someone cleared their throat. A small sound, almost apologetic. But it faded into nothing as the man rolled on, eyes dancing from screen to table to audience, never landing long enough to see the discomfort growing around him. He didn't see the glances toward her. He didn't see the stiff postures. He didn't notice the slow shift in tone, but she saw everything.
Ow.
And she said nothing. Not yet. The room remained still as the man continued his monologue, oblivious to the quiet storm building across from him. The woman hadn't moved since taking her seat. Her posture never changed, not even to cross her arms or shift in her chair. She watched him with the same composed expression she walked in, with measured, alert, and unreadable. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, but he didn't notice. He mistook her calm for submission, her stillness for irrelevance. He launched into a presentation slide deck filled with buzzwords and self-congratulatory graphs. "We're bleeding money in departments that don't produce," he declared, tapping the screen with confidence. "Marketing, bloated. R&D, overrated. And frankly, if we outsource half of this junk, we could double our margins by Q2. His voice was forceful, condescending, as if everyone in the room was there to validate his brilliance. "And let's talk culture," he said, pacing. "This company's gotten soft. It's too much coddling, too much emotional intelligence nonsense. Real leadership requires thick skin." His eyes flicked toward her for just a second, calculated, sharp, like a jab masked as a general observation. She didn't respond. He seemed to take that as a sign of agreement, a mistake he wouldn't recognize until it was far too late. The atmosphere began to shift subtly. He could feel it in the way shoulders started to tighten in the stolen glances, shared between team members. Midway through his fourth slide, a senior executive leaned slightly toward his neighbor, voice low but urgent. "Should we say something?" Question hung in the air, suspended between etiquette and fear. His colleague glanced toward the woman. She caught the motion and gave the slightest shake of her head. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. It was decisive. No one interrupted him, he continued, now fueled by his own voice. "If we're going to win, we need leadership that knows how to take command. That means no distractions, no politics, and definitely no hand-holding." Another dig, another glance. Still she didn't flinch. Her silence was deliberate, surgical. The longer she waited, the more confident he became. The more he talked. The deeper he buried himself. The HR director sat at the far end of the table, unusually quiet. Her eyes darted between the man and the woman, lips pressed into a thin line. She looked as though she knew something was wrong, something profoundly out of balance but couldn't yet name it aloud. She adjusted her glasses, cleared her throat once, then said nothing. The woman gently tapped her watch. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to know. 3 seconds. 2. 1. A soft chime broke the silence. Barely audible, but final. Her watch had reached its mark. She stood. The man froze, mid-sentence, still holding the remote in his hand. Finger hovering over the next slide. The room turned toward her as she stepped smoothly around the table. Her heels clicked once, twice each step measured, every eye following her path. No rush, no drama. Just motion backed by something undeniable. She reached the head of the table and placed a black folder down directly in front of him. No words, no build-up. Just a simple motion followed by absolute silence. He looked confused for the first time. He opened the folder slowly, glancing down at the contents. His smile flickered, faltered, and then vanished altogether. Inside were 3 documents. The first, signed termination orders, effective immediately. The second, a formal complaint summary compiled over the past 90 days, each entry timestamped, and backed by witness statements. The third, a full-page memo outlining SEC violations under investigation, complete with supporting evidence gathered by the company's compliance division. The color drained from his face. His hand trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages, disbelief giving way to something closer to panic. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to make a speech. She simply met his eyes and said without emotion, without gloating, "You've been under internal review for 3 weeks. I just needed you to finish talking." There was no dramatic gasp, No shouting, just silence.
No.
A heavy, suffocating silence that settled over the room like dust. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The woman didn't wait for him to respond. She turned to the rest of the room, her voice calm, direct, and absolute. This meeting is now formally in session. The seat is no longer occupied. No one moved. No one objected. No one questioned. The silence shattered like glass. A collective gasp moved through the boardroom, followed by a ripple of voices, questions, whispers. Nervous laughter from those who didn't yet understand the gravity of what just happened. The man still sat, frozen, clutching the opened folder like it might vanish if he held it tightly enough. But the writing was clear. His name, his offenses, the signatures, the dates. No one in the room could unsee it. The legal counsel, seated near the window, stood slowly and walked to the head of the table with purpose. He didn't glance at the woman. He didn't need to. She had already done everything. Professionally, the lawyer turned to the man and said, "You're no longer authorized to be here. I'll ask you to leave the premises immediately." The man blinked, slowly, as if waking from a dream. "Wait, this is a mistake," he stammered. "You can't just—" He turned to the others for support. No one met his eyes. "You all know me. I've led this team for years. He gestured to the screen still glowing behind him, full of bullet points and graphs now rendered meaningless. "This is some kind of—" The double doors at the far end of the room opened. Two security officers stepped inside, silent, deliberate. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence alone brought a sharp stillness back into the room. The woman didn't move. She didn't give them a signal. It was already arranged, coordinated with clockwork precision. They stood quietly behind the man's chair, waiting. Still, she hadn't said another word. The man rose slowly, a nervous smile creeping across his face. "We don't need to do this. Come on, this is ridiculous. I built this place." He looked around, desperation leaking into his voice. "You're really going to let this happen?" One of the executives near the end of the table looked down at his notes. Another gently pushed their chair back, creating distance. There was no response, no defense, just the sound of the man breathing harder, the faint squeak of leather chairs, and the hum of power shifting away from him like receding tide. She remained standing, composed, watching. The legal counsel handed him the folder again. "This includes a formal statement from compliance and the board," he said. "You'll have an opportunity to respond through your legal team. Until then, you're barred from all company systems and property." The man looked to the woman one last time. "You can't be serious," he said, barely above a whisper. She didn't blink. "You had 7 minutes," she said, her voice even and clear. "That was your interview? You failed." Stillness followed, heavier than any scream. He stood frozen for a beat longer. Then slowly gathered his notes, though they no longer held value, and followed the officers to the door. He didn't look back. The sound of the doors closing behind him was sharp, final. Silence returned. But this time, it wasn't awkward. It was clean. Cleansed. The woman turned back to the table and opened her own folder, placing it at the center. She pressed a button on a small remote, and the screen behind her blinked once. The old slides disappeared, replaced by a series of internal audits. Time-stamped video clips and logged testimony. The evidence unfolded like a slow unraveling. Misuse of corporate funds. Company card expenses funneled through dummy vendors. Aggressive internal emails flagged by HR. Recordings of meetings where junior employees, especially women, were belittled, mocked, dismissed. Her compliance team had been thorough, precise, and patient. Every quote displayed had a time, a date, and a corroborating witness. Damning slideshow. But she didn't comment. She didn't need to. Each item spoke for itself. The room absorbed it all in silence. No one dared interrupt. At one point, the HR director leaned forward, visibly shaken. She whispered something to the CFO, who only nodded slowly. A few heads hung low in quiet shame, not all for him, but for the months they stayed silent, for the times they had watched, laughed awkwardly, or said nothing when they knew something was wrong. She let the last slide hold on the screen longer than the others. It was a summary, page clean, concise, final. Oh. She closed the file in front of her and sat back down.
Oh.
Her presence filled the room now, not with volume, but with clarity. It wasn't just that she had exposed him, it was how she had done it. No outburst. No theatrics. Just precision and timing. Then, for the first time since he'd left, someone in the room spoke. A junior executive, barely out of their 20s, cleared their throat. "About time," they said quietly, not looking at anyone in particular. It wasn't said with spite, it was said with relief. With recognition, she didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply adjusted her jacket, folded her hands on the table, and said, "Let's begin." For a moment, the room lingered in a strange quiet, still stunned, still processing the precision of what had just unfolded. But she wasn't done. Not yet. She opened her folder again, this time removing a slim envelope with the company's embossed seal. Without ceremony, she placed it in front of the legal counsel, who read it silently and then nodded. He stood and addressed the room with steady authority. Effective as of last quarter, he announced, she was appointed Global Chief Executive Officer by unanimous board vote. The words struck like a quiet explosion. Chairs shifted. Eyebrows lifted. One or two people gasped before catching themselves. She didn't smile. She didn't bow. She only folded her hands in front of her. The appointment had already happened. She had been CEO for weeks, perhaps even months. But she hadn't walked in with fanfare. She hadn't sent out memos or staged press releases. She chose silence. She chose presence. She chose to watch who stepped forward, who stepped back, and who said nothing at all. She had taken notes not with a pen, but with observation. And now the silence that once misunderstood her had become the silence that commanded her. The implications began to land. Some people sat straighter in their chairs, recalibrating. Others lowered their eyes, guilt settling in. But she didn't dwell on their reactions. She simply stood again and walked to the whiteboard at the far end of the room. With a marker, she drew a single clean line across it, then divided it in two. "This is the line," she said. "This is where we stop tolerating what we call culture, when it's really just dysfunction." The room listened. "Starting today," she continued, "we're not just fixing behavior, we're redesigning the structure that allows it to exist." She turned back to the table. Effective immediately. The head of HR is relieved of duties. So is the head of compliance. So is the VP of people operations. If you've spent the last year covering up, looking away, or explaining things instead of changing them, you are done here. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her clarity hit harder than volume ever could. She passed another folder to the CFO. "These are the new transparency guidelines. Salaries, promotions, complaints, investigations, they'll be traceable and open to audit by a rotating staff panel. Not a closed door, not a closed loop. You want to lead here? Then be visible." No one dared interrupt her now. Some nodded, some froze. A few looked genuinely relieved, like they'd been waiting for someone with the courage to do this all. Along she continued calmly, evenly, like she was reading a weather report. "We will no longer elevate people for being the loudest. You'll elevate people for being the clearest, the most consistent, the ones who lead without needing applause." She paused, then looked around the room. "We don't correct people with noise. We correct systems with proof." You could feel the shift, a reset, a clean page. The energy was no longer fire, it was gravity. Real leadership doesn't fill space. It creates space for others to rise. And that's what she had just done by removing one man she'd made. Room for a dozen others to finally breathe. The meeting ended with no fanfare. She gave no rousing speech. She simply gathered her things and left the room. On her way out, she passed the administrative assistant who'd been nervously watching everything unfold through the glass wall. She paused, looked the young woman in the eye and said, "You're doing more than people see. Keep going." It wasn't grand, it wasn't loud. But to the woman who heard it, it might as well have been thunder. Downstairs, the press had gathered word. Travels fast in a building built on egos. Cameras clicked. Reporters pushed forward. Ma'am, can we confirm, are you the new CEO? Was today's termination planned? Do you plan to issue a statement? She stepped forward, not smiling, but not guarded, calm as ever, clear as day. I don't demand a seat, she said. I redesigned the table. The crowd went silent. Cameras kept rolling. That was all they were going to get. She turned and walked back into the building, disappearing through the revolving doors without looking back. The company's towering logo shimmered above her in steel and glass and changed on the outside. But from this moment forward, completely different within. On the executive floor, a janitor wheeled a small cart quietly down the hallway. Inside, one of the bins, half covered by other discarded office debris, was a polished nameplate. It had once sat proudly at the head of the table. Now it lay tilted, cracked along the edge, barely readable. It wasn't thrown away in anger. It was recycled, because in this company, waste doesn't belong at the top.